Good morning, Celia.
Good morning, Sigrid.
I'm with Dr. Celia Gershenson, who has been in behavior analysis for some time, and she's going to tell me about some of the more interesting things that happened in what nowadays we think of as the early days of behavior analysis. So, Celia, what events led to your deciding to become a behavior analyst?
Okay, at the time that I started college, and this was at Barnard College, which was still is an all-women's institution, most of my peers and compatriots and good friends were going into teaching, and I decided, no, that's not really what I want to do. So maybe I will go into school psychology. At that time, that's not what was called, but that's what it is today. And I started taking courses. I knew I was going to be a psych major, and I was not happy. And at Barnard, we all were required to take an experimental psychology course. And the section that I was in was taught by Donald Cook. And at that time at Columbia, people in psychology were using Keller and Schoenfeld, Principles of Psychology, as the text. At Barnard, we were doing the usual experimental stuff. And so Donald said, you know, there's a chapter in this book they're using at Columbia about reinforcement. I think you should read it. And this is after we had done sensation perception. So I read the chapter, and I said, ooh, this is nice. So I went to Donald, and I said, Professor Cook, do you have a copy of the rest of the book? And he looked at me, and he said, oh, sure, here, take it away and bring it back. Well, a week later, I brought it back. And I said, that's my beginning of behavior analysis. At that time, it was called the experimental analysis of behavior. And that's how I started.
And how then did your training proceed?
Well, I worked at that time, Rosemary Perel, Posey Perel, was doing research looking at auditory discrimination and using operant techniques in various animals, and there were labs in which we could work, and so I started that as an undergraduate. Also, I don't really know if Posey and Donald and a few other people started something that was called Barnabas the Psych Rat, which was essentially training rats to go through a whole series of maneuvers as a way of teaching people how to condition a rat. And so I was one of the people who trained them. And so after that, I went on to graduate work at Columbia University. And my first course, among others, was with Fred Keller. And at that time, he was not doing program instructions. He was one of the best teachers that existed, that I've ever had. And then Nat Schoenfeld became my advisor. And one of the things that happened when I started reading Principles of Psychology, I became fascinated with response variability. And so a lot of my work, and certainly my thesis, and even after that, was on, and I'm still interested in response variability, and that was Nat Schoenfeld's area. And so I was one of Nat Schoenfeld's few women graduate students. And
you told a story one time about speaking about Nat Schoenfeld.
Yes. In about 1990 or 1991, there was at ABBA, there was a celebration of both Nat and Fred, and basically, I think it was, I don't know what the year was, the publication, maybe the 50th of their book. And Donald Cook arranged a symposium on various things related to both of them, but as well as the book. And I talked about what it was like to be a woman in that field and a graduate student at that time. And it was an interesting experience because One, I'll tell you a story. Nat Schoenfeld's first graduate course that we all took, which was basically a seminar course, and we were each assigned a topic, and I, of course, chose response variability. And he did this with everybody. And I started giving my presentation, and he interrupted me every other sentence and asked me questions. He wasn't sure I was up to it. And after about 10 minutes, it became clear that I knew what I was talking about inside out. I had really prepared because I had learned that as a woman at that time in an experimental area, you had to prove yourself over and over and over again, and that you were serious. And unfortunately, that's still sometimes the case these days, as you know, Celia.
Yes, I think it is.
Not as much, and there are many more of us. And so, but once he decided I was serious, that I wasn't just there passing time to get married, to find a husband and get married, things were very smooth.
You mentioned a minute ago that Fred Keller was, I think you said, the best teacher you ever had. The students of the future, of course, will never have an opportunity to meet Fred Keller, and those of us who had a chance to meet him and know him are incredibly privileged. What made him such a wonderful teacher?
Well, I think maybe I can illustrate it. Some years ago, obviously, I went to the Southeastern Behavior Association meeting, and I stayed with the Kellers. They were at that time in North Carolina, and I was giving an hour presentation. I had been invited to talk basically about response variability, and I was nervous. And Fred said, "Well, this is what you should do or should not do. One, don't put too much on your slides. Two, really just talk about one or two or three things, okay? And again, make sure don't put a lot of graphs on or a lot of tables and such things. And do that." When going back a little bit, at Columbia, we were all teaching assistants, and there came a time when each of our advisors would say, "Well, you're going to teach a course," okay? And a group of us were sitting around and nervous, and Fred came in and looked at us. He knew exactly what was going on, and he said, what's wrong? And we said, "Well, Fred, you're such a good teacher. Give us some pointers." And he said, "Well, in the first two lectures," and most of us were teaching introductory psychology, "in the first two lectures, you're going to tell them all you know about psychology." Okay, they didn't understand a word. So take sentence by sentence and devote the rest of one class each to every sentence that you presented, that you talked about, and that will be the course. And when he gave lectures, they were fascinating. There were a lot of examples, and then, but they were all. You really had to understand behavior analysis in order to complete that class successfully. And so it seemed deceptively simple, but when you put it all together, it wasn't very lot.
Celia, I'd like to go back a bit to your entering into Columbia University. I know when I read how Skinner got into Harvard, I was amazed at how different it was getting into a graduate program than it is today. What did you have to do to get accepted into Columbia?
I guess I was lucky because I was at Barnard and I was working with Donald Cook, and I had occasionally gone over to Columbia for talks. Murray Sidman would come and give talks, Joe Brady, and we could go over and listen. And so, in a sense, there was a formal application, but also I had the recommendations of Donald and Posey Perel, and although I don't think I had met either Fred Keller or Nat Schoenfeld beforehand, essentially I did well enough on the exam, on the entrance exams that we had to take. If we did have to take them, yeah, I guess we did. And so it was also a question. Yes, this person is interested. I don't know. The fact, one, that I was coming from Barnard, so people were familiar with my training. And although it probably was a little bit harder for me, being a woman at that time, because there were several other people, women in my peer group. One of them, did both of them drop out? I think by the end, at least in the behavior analytic group, that is the experimental analysis of behavior group, I think by that time I became the only woman left. So it was different. I also applied to other schools, which I did not get into. And partly some of those were not schools that were specifically the experimental analysis of behavior.
Well, you were lucky that you got in that one.
Yes, very lucky. And
have you continued with your work in variability, or did you continue after you?
I did continue. I should also say this is something. Well, there are things I would do differently. I actually did not finish my degree at Columbia. I finished my degree at the University of Minnesota. And actually my thesis is a response variability thesis. The work I did at Columbia was with rats, and the work that I did at Minnesota was with monkeys. So, and I guess that was a mistake. What happened was, at that time, and we're talking about the 60s, it was very difficult again for women to get positions in academics. And Hofstra at that time, now university at that time, Hofstra College, was hiring people, and they wanted people in learning. And I applied for the job, as did a few others. And I got the job, and I was in the middle of, or just beginning to run the research for my dissertation. And Nat said, Celia, take it, because there, who knows what other opportunities are going to be. I think you can finish at Columbia. But at that time, at Hofstra, one taught 4 courses per semester. And this is, an almost PhD. There's a story. One of the courses I was asked to teach was statistics. Statistics is not my strong point. And I actually used the notes of someone who was in graduate school with me, who was good in mathematics, to teach that course. They didn't ask me to teach that course again. But, so if I were to do things differently, I would finish. But under the circumstances, it was a good decision, because it's not clear what would have happened.
So you took the job at Hofstra, and how long were you there?
2 years.
2 years. Well, how did you get to Minnesota?
Well, at the end of those 2 years, I married a mathematician who was finishing up a 2-year instructorship at Princeton. And we went to Cornell for 5 years, and then we came to Minnesota.
So why didn't you get your degree at Columbia? Just teaching all those courses just prevented your dissertation?
Yeah, in other words, I did not finish writing up the dissertation.
Okay.
There were a number of circumstances. And so, I think I should have tried harder, but that's to finish.
Well, it happens a lot, as we know. It
Yes.
happens a lot. And once you take a full-time job, it's very hard to get that done.
It's a little, depending upon when you do it, it's a little better. So I would advise people not, these days, outside of what's going on now in terms of the dearth of jobs, I would certainly, I tell my students, don't take a job until you're finished, because it's going to be harder to go back. And
so how did you get to Minnesota?
Well, I got to Minnesota, or we got to Minnesota, because that's the job that my husband took. And it was very good. What was interesting is that he had a choice between Indiana and Minnesota, and we decided at that time, we had some young children, we decided Minnesota would be a better place to bring up children. So there are factors that factors that you have to consider when you're looking at jobs. And
when you went to Minnesota, did you have to start over and do coursework again, or
well,
did you just pick up with your dissertation where you left off at Columbia?
I did. Things had changed enough. For example, one of the things, I guess I'm probably the only person that has had as either a formal or informal advisor both Fred Keller, Nat Schoenfeld, and Kenneth McCorkadale. And so Kenneth and Travis Thompson officially was my advisor. I did take some more coursework and do some work, but I then continued with the dissertation, which was on response variability.
So you already had all your data at that time?
I had the rat data, the monkey data. We decided to expand the thesis, to incorporate some things that were not thought of at the time. Now, this is a question of about 10 years. So.
You must have been one of the first people to work in variability.
In what?
On topic of variability.
Well, not really. There was a strain at Columbia. Mine was probably, it started with Antonitis in the 40s, it must have been, who looked at response variability using a 15 centimeter slot. And then when we look at variability, we don't look at rate. We look at duration, force, topography. And I was probably the second or third thesis at Columbia looking at duration. I followed Stuart Margulies, who looked at duration. Don Mintz was working on force. Joe Notterman, who then was at Princeton, continued doing particularly force.
Did anybody preempt Nuringer on his approach to variability, where it's actually increased in variability was increased by reinforcement?
Variability was increased. Oh, okay. In the basic theme of what I was doing and these other people I've mentioned were doing is the Antonitis study was the first of that nature, and where he found that the effect of, if you have a 50 centimeter slot, and anywhere along the 50 centimeter slot, if the rat pokes its nose through the slot, it's reinforced. And just this is again regular an FR1, then you get stereotype nose poking. In extinction, variability increases.
Okay.
And so we were playing with things like different schedules of reinforcement. Oh, if you then, and Antonitis did, if you then can recondition the animal, the response becomes even more stereotyped. And so some of us played with things like different discrimination, different schedules of reinforcement. Also, what happens if you signal a signal reaching criterion? In other words, another aspect of it, can you increase the duration of the response by reinforcing only longer responses? The answer is yes. You still get, interestingly enough, some very short responses. Mm-hmm. And then and the response becomes more variable if you don't have a signal indicating you've reached criterion. Then in extinction it goes up. If you recondition again, you get those results.
What do you consider your most important contribution to behavior analysis?
Yeah. I think my most important contributions, because I've done very little publishing, I've given some talks, is working with students and getting them to become interested in behavior analysis. And even for those who don't, getting them to look at behavior analysis as a way to look at animal or human behavior. These days, I call myself an aging behavioral gerontologist because my research is still not so much in variability, but looking at learning and memory and attention in normal, these days, normal older adults. And the techniques we use in my approach and my interpretation is basically a behavior analytic approach. I'm still looking at basic processes as opposed to applied processes. Although it becomes easy to say, oh, this would be interesting and we could modify behavior of older adults this way.
So maybe you ought to publish some of that so
yes,
other people could benefit from it. How do you think behavior analysis has changed over the years since you were a graduate student?
Okay. I think there are two changes. One, well, at least two changes. The one change was when I was a graduate student, we were not only expert in our areas, but we also were expected to know sensation and perception, social psychology, so that the other fields were much more accessible. And that, of course, is not true these days. I think, again, I think these days behavior analysis, and since my area is more basic research rather than applied behavior analysis. I'm sorry. Over the years, what has happened, people who were only doing basic research went over and started doing applied behavior analysis, ION, etc. And so I see the development and then perhaps the explosion of applied behavior analysis. Also, I think we are going into areas that behavior analysts didn't 40 years ago. In other words, we're looking at much more complex behavior, things that the cognitive psychologists say is not our purview, but in fact we're making contributions to that. And looking at that, I think, is one of the best things that has happened to behavior analysts.
Well, you mentioned something that you would do differently if you were to replay your life.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you would do differently, other than perhaps finish your dissertation when you're...
I think I try to publish more. One of the I was about to say, one of the things that I have been doing that I wouldn't do differently, that I might have started earlier, one of the sort of side tasks that I do is try to increase the diversity of graduate students going to graduate school, which means we try to recruit students from disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. And I think really, I think I'd like to see, for example, ABBA do much more in this area than it does, because that is really the future. And I don't think we're doing as good a job in working with these groups, because the students that do go into it then go back to their own, many of them, not all, I mean, these are good researchers and such things, and they go back and work, either if they're going to go into applied behavior analysis, work in the community, or else teach. And so I think we have to do a better job with that, and I'd like to see that. That's not me doing things differently, but maybe expanding.
You say you're doing some work in gerontology now, some basic research. Is that area, or perhaps what other areas would you like to see more work in behavior analysis being done in?
Certainly in gerontology, as you said, I'm not sure. Would take me a few minutes to think of that.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, how do you, looking into the future, what do you see as the future of behavior analysis? What do you see as where it's going and what's going to happen?
What I'd like to see is more, what I perceive at this point is that there is the area is so big and includes so many different areas that it's like a very large university, which Minnesota is, where you don't get to see what other people are doing. And I think that's a detriment to each field, each area, each individual area. And of course, when I started, ABBA, and Eastern Psychological Association, was small, and we talk to each other, and we can learn from each other. And so I think what I would like to see is, I don't know how one does this, but a way of some communication on some level of what are you doing? There are just as there was a time when basic researchers in behavior analysis would have nothing to do with applied behavior analysis. That was wrong, and of course that changed. I think now there are the view for some applied behavior analysts is that you don't have to know the basic principles, and I think that's just not how the field will grow or develop. Because if you don't understand the basic principles and have a feel, know what they do, what they are,
in some depth, not just memorizing the definition.
I'll give you an example. I was in a seminar. A colleague and I were running the seminar, and it included people in behavioral pharmacology, and they were describing their study, and I said, well, what schedule of reinforcement did you use? Why did you choose that schedule of reinforcement? And the person giving the talk, which was a nice talk, graduate student, said, well, does it matter which schedule I use? At which point, both I and my colleague, our jaws dropped. And we said, okay, I think that for the next 2 sessions, we will give the presentation on basic principles of behavior analysis. That should never happen.
Wow.
And these were not people who were not, they were supposedly in behavior analysis.
Well, I have one more question. And since we hope that students of the future look to these tapes that we're making and remember about our history, I would like to give you an opportunity to send a message to students of the future. What would you like to tell them?
I'd like to tell students that to this day, I find behavior analysis exciting, fun, and the way to look at behavior. It doesn't mean that nothing else works. You have to also learn, as we did. One of the things that Nat Schoenfeld told me once, he said, my committee consisted, except for Nat and Bill Cumming, consisted of people in other fields in the department, is that you should, in your 2 minutes of spare time that you want to look at other areas, to get a feel for what they're doing, even cognitive psychologists. I work with cognitive psychologists. They use operant techniques. And there's no conflict, and we learn from each other. That doesn't change my principles. It doesn't change their view. And when you pick an area in behavior analysis, make sure you pick an area that excites you and continues to excite you. And one of the things, I run a summer research program for undergraduates from all over who want to go on to graduate school in all areas. And I say, don't pick the field that seems the one that's in vogue at this point. Or if you have questions, make sure that it's something you will work hard on, because graduate school is a drudgery at times, and you have to go through hoops you'd really rather not go through, but you have to. And so you have to be excited about what you want to do.
That's great advice. That's great advice. Thank you, Celia.
You're
Dr.
quite
Celia
welcome.
Gershenson, thank you so much.
You're welcome.